This video is made possible by Blinkist. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/biographics are going to get unlimited access for 1 week just to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. More about that a bit later on, but for now, let's just get on with it. Henry Ford was an American success story. Through his dogged perseverance, engineering brilliance, and innovative production techniques, he brought an affordable motor vehicle to the masses, creating an empire in the process. And yet, there were other aspects of the man that didn't really fit comfortably into the American icon image. From his anti-Semitism to his vehement opposition to unions, Henry Ford was a man who defied description. And in today's Biographics video, we're going to get close and personal with Henry Ford. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863 in Greenfield Township, Michigan. He was the oldest of 5 children to William and Mary Ford. William was an Irish immigrant, while Mary was a first-generation American of Belgian heritage. The Ford family, they were middle-class farmers. Henry was particularly close with his mother, who he absolutely adored. The children worked hard to help their father perform the day's labor. Henry pitched in enthusiastically, though he never really enjoyed the work. He later commented, "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother on the farm that I loved." Henry, he disliked school, much preferring to study on his own terms. He had a huge amount of curiosity, and this was mixed with his creativity. By the time he had reached his teens, Henry was obsessed with gadgets. He had a habit of taking apart watches and then putting them back together. He did this over and over again until he could do it in a matter of minutes. His reputation as a watch repairman, it began to grow, and soon he was maintaining the timepieces of everyone in his neighborhood. When he was 13, Henry saw a steam-powered motor vehicle for the first time. He was fascinated with it, and he instantly recognized its potential to replace the horse as the main means of transportation. From that point on, he was absolutely obsessed with automobiles. A short while after the encounter with the vehicle, Henry's beloved mother, she died very suddenly. Naturally, Henry was heartbroken. From that point on, he wanted to get off the farm as it simply held too many memories. His opportunity, it came 3 years later when he was offered his first job. He moved to Detroit to become an apprentice machinist for James F. Flower & Brothers, who made machine parts. He later moved to the Detroit Dry Dock Company. By night, he worked at a watch repair company in order to pay his rent. Any spare time that he had, he'd spend on his mechanical experiments. In 1882, at the age of 19, Henry returned to the family farm to help his father. He still hated farming, but he loved tinkering with the farm machinery. His father had purchased a Westinghouse portable steam engine, and Henry made it his mission to perfect the use of it. He became so good on the machine that he managed to get a summer job at the Westinghouse Electric Company in Detroit. He demonstrated and repaired steam engines that were used to power heavy machinery. When he turned 21, Henry's father gifted him with a sizable parcel of land. He now split his time between working the land, demonstrating Westinghouse machines, and studying part-time for a bookkeeping diploma. In early 1888, he met a young woman by the name of Clara Jane Bryant. After a short courtship, the couple were married on April the 11th. 5 years later, their first and only child, Edsel, was born. Ford now had a family to look after. He made ends meet by cutting and selling the timber on his land. Within a year, he set up a sawmill which became moderately profitable. He built a mechanical workshop on the farm and continued tinkering on heavy machinery. Henry had been brought up in a Christian household, and now that he was a family man, he seemed to take religion much more seriously. Every Sunday, he made an 8-mile round trip to attend the nearest Episcopalian church. He came to believe in reincarnation, which was not an Episcopalian concept. Rather than finding another church, however, he simply added it to his own personal belief system. He had an evangelizing spirit, enjoying sharing his beliefs with others. About his religious beliefs, he wrote, "Religion, like anything else, is a thing that should be kept working. I see no use in spending a great deal of time learning about heaven and hell. In my opinion, man makes his own heaven and hell and carries it around with him. Both of them are states of mind." In 1885, Ford was tasked with fixing an Otto engine, a large, stationary, single-cylinder, internal combustion four-stroke engine designed by German Nikolaus Otto. After pulling it apart and analyzing every component, he put it back together in working form and then proceeded to make his own version of this machine. By 1890, he was working on a petrol-powered engine. In September of 1891, Henry secured a position at the Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. He and Clara moved to the city to make a new life. Within 2 years, Ford was promoted to the position of chief engineer. Along with this promotion came a substantial pay rise. This provided him the means to work on his petrol engine when he wasn't working for Thomas Edison. In 1896, the countless evenings tinkering in his home workshop, they finally paid off with the unveiling of his first self-propelled vehicle. He called it the Ford Quadricycle. He presented his prototype to Edison Company executives, including Thomas Edison himself. Edison was intrigued and, in fact, delighted with Ford's invention. Encouraged by the praise of his boss, Ford developed a Mark II model with numerous improvements. Ford's newer and better quadricycle caught the attention of a Detroit lumber baron by the name of William H. Murphy. Murphy put his money behind the young inventor, allowing Henry to resign from Edison and start his own company. He called it the Detroit Automobile Company. Investors wanted to capitalize on Ford's petrol motor as quickly as possible. They pressured him to rush production. As a result, the vehicles produced were of a lower quality and a higher price than Ford was happy with. Having produced just 20 automobiles, the company was dissolved in January of 1901. Ford was more relieved than deterred with the closure of the Detroit Automobile Company. With the pressure to produce no longer on him, he put his efforts into designing and building a 26-horsepower automobile in October of 1901. In order to get publicity for his invention, he began entering racing competitions. After soundly beating the local champion in a 10-mile race, he won back the confidence of his investors. They were prepared to back a second company, and so the Ford Motor Company was born with Henry as its chief engineer. However, the same tensions developed as previously. When the investors brought in a consultant to check Henry's focus on technological improvements, he left the company. The new man, Henry Leland, went on to create his own vehicle, the Cadillac, and the company was renamed the Cadillac Automobile Company. Ford now teamed up with a former cycle racing champion named Tom Cooper. Together they produced an 80-plus horsepower vehicle that they dubbed the 999. This car was raced by top racer Barry Oldfield to a resounding victory in an October of 1902 race. With this success under his belt, Ford entered into a third company. He teamed up with a coal dealer from Detroit named Alexander Malcolmson to form Ford and Malcolmson Limited. He now set about making an affordable automobile for the working man. Ford and Malcolmson, they found a factory and they got to work. They contracted the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, who owned a local machine shop, to produce all the parts that they needed. Within a year, Ford had his new and affordable vehicle. The challenge now was to sell it. Initial sales were slow, which led to a cash flow crisis. New investors were brought on board, and the company was reincorporated as the Ford Motor Company in June of 1903. Ford's new economical automobile was put to the test on the ice-covered surface of Lake St. Clair between Michigan and Ontario. It achieved a new land speed record of 91.3 miles per hour, that's 146.9 kilometers an hour. Barry Oldfield then toured the country to demonstrate the car. This publicity brought the name Henry Ford to a wide audience. Sales of Ford's new car, they grew steadily. By 1905, the company, it was absolutely thriving. Ford were the only car manufacturer who were catering to the middle classes. Because of Ford, the automobile, it was no longer just a plaything for the rich. Now it was able to be seen as a viable means of transport for pretty much everybody. Now, just before we get into Ford's most notable vehicle, of course the Model T, let me tell you a bit about today's sponsor who make these sort of longer videos possible, and that sponsor is Blinkist. Look, now if you're watching this channel, you're probably curious about things. I mean, why else would you commit to a 20-minute video about Henry Ford? And this is why Blinkist is such a great fit for this very channel. Blinkist is an app that takes the best insights and need-to-know info from thousands of non-fiction books and condenses them to just 15 minutes that you can read or you can listen to. 8 million people currently use this app, and they're consuming content that's from history to self-help. The way I consume Blinkist is that my commute to work is about 15 minutes each way, so it's perfect for a little hit of knowledge. Blinkist is about 15 minutes of audio or text to read. It's really a way to fast-track myself to the most important knowledge from important books. One that I recently recapped was Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, a book that I've read in the past and love. Blinkist provided me an amazing reminder of all of the best stuff from that book, but it's not essential that I'd read it in the first place. But this is also a biography channel, so how about I recommend one of the many books from Walter Isaacson on that platform. He's biography of people like Einstein, Franklin, Da Vinci, Steve Jobs. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/biographics are going to get unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. Get it now and grab those 7 habits, or maybe the biography of Einstein or Da Vinci. Again, that's completely free. Just go to Blinkist.com/biographics, and let's get back to Ford. In October 1908, Ford released the famous Model T. This streamlined vehicle had a number of innovative features, including having the steering wheel on the left, an entirely enclosed transmission engine, 4 cylinders cast in solid block, and a pair of semi-elliptic suspension springs. The Model T was easier than anything else on the market to drive, and it was inexpensive to repair. Now, with the Model T, Ford introduced the assembly line production process. Now, he wasn't the first to use assembly line production procedures, but he did refine it to make it as efficient and therefore as cost-effective as possible. Rather than having a group of employees working on a single vehicle, Ford set up a conveyor system where the car moved from one station to another. At each station, a highly skilled worker would focus on just one aspect of the construction. That worker would then repeat the same job over and over again. This process cut down the time to produce a Model T from 12 to only 6 hours. As a result of these improved practices, Ford was able to sell his Model T at the unheard of price of $895, which is $23,010 in today's money. This was less than half of what other manufacturers were selling their vehicles for. As the assembly line process was streamlined, the price of the Model T came down even further. By 1912, it was down to $575. On the strength of the massive popularity of the Model T, Ford was able to take a 48% share of the US automobile market by 1914. In 1913, though, a multi-story factory was built in Highland Park. Assembly of the Model T would begin on the 4th floor with the engine, then it would move down floor by floor until the body was added on the final and ground floor. Ford set up a network of Model T franchises all over the country. Salesmen sold not only the affordable car, but also the concept of vehicle travel and the opportunities that came with it. With the Model T, the country would be opened up to the masses with all the wonders that it held in store. Ford was determined that his buyers would become loyal Ford customers for life. As a result, he offered an unheard-of guarantee. When you bought a Model T, the Ford factory would stand behind you, maintaining it at the most affordable price possible. Ford was a firm believer in welfare capitalism. He wanted to maintain a happy workforce who were treated fairly. As a result, he introduced innovative programs and benefits for his staff. In 1914, he introduced the living wage, where each worker received a minimum of $5 per day. This would be the equivalent of about $120 in 2019. This is almost double the pay that most other companies were offering at the time. One reason that Ford brought in the living wage was that prior to its introduction, his factories had a very high employee turnover rate. Some departments numbering 100 men turned over 30 employees a year. This was largely due to the monotony of the production line process. Now the increased pay offset the boredom of the job. The living wage allowed Ford to attract the best mechanics in Detroit. Other companies, they were forced to raise their wages or simply lose their workers. Ford also did other things to ensure a happy workforce. His factories, they had cafeterias, water fountains, healthcare, and company-sponsored sports teams. The benefits that Ford brought to his workforce, though, they came with a few strings. He expected his workers to live clean lives in accordance with Christian moral principles. He established a social department which kept a close eye on the private lives of his employees. Anyone who was seen to be over-drinking, gambling, or not providing adequately for their family would be subjected to an intervention. Meanwhile, business-wise, sales of the Model T were going from strength to strength. A drop in the price of the basic touring car to $360 saw sales reaching 472,000 in 1916. Every single one of those cars was black, as it was the color that dried the fastest on the assembly line. This led Ford to utter the rather famous line that any customer can have a car painted any color he wants, so long as it is black. Ford was completely opposed to US participation in World War I. He was a pacifist who was offended by other businessmen who profited from war trade. In 1915, he teamed up with Hungarian-born Jewish pacifist Rosika Schwimmer and funded a peace ship to travel to Europe and advocate for an end to the fighting. 170 leading pacifists boarded the ship and headed, along with Ford and Schwimmer, to the Netherlands and then on to Sweden. The voyage did not have official US government blessing, and it soon became the subject of intense ridicule. Ford decided to distance himself from the enterprise, and he left the ship and made his own way back to the United States. Around this time, Ford began to make public his anti-Semitic beliefs. He claims that the war had been started by German Jewish bankers and that he was collecting information that would make that fact clear. Despite its founder's pacifist and anti-Semitic sentiments, the Ford Motor Company was pressed into producing engines for fighter planes and anti-submarine boats once the US entered the war in 1917. In 1918, at the urging of President Woodrow Wilson, Ford ran for the Senate seat in Michigan. Ford was an advocate for Wilson's League of Nations, and the president felt that if Ford won Michigan, it could tip the scale in his favor in Congress. He told Ford, "You are the only man in Michigan who can be elected and help bring about the peace you so desire." Ford, he ran, but he lost by about 4,500 votes. Still, he did remain a staunch advocate of the League of Nations. A month after the end of the war, in December of 1919, Ford handed the reins of the Ford Motor Company over to his son Edsel, who was now 26 years old. However, the father retained the right to veto any decision. In 1918, Ford had purchased a small newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Every Ford factory issued this paper to its employees. Throughout the 1920s, Ford used this paper as the vehicle for disseminating his anti-Semitic views. He believed that an international Jewish conspiracy was working to take control of the world. Between 1920 and 1922, he published a multi-volume work titled The International Jew. Historians now believe that these books were an influence on Adolf Hitler's worldview. During the war years, Ford worked with his son to take the Ford Motor Company to the rest of the world. A massive complex was built at River Rouge in Dearborn, Michigan. This was the world's largest industrial complex at the time. By 1929, he had thriving dealerships on all 6 continents. Ford wanted his business to become a vertically integrated company. This meant that every aspect of supply for the company would be owned by the company. This meant that the company wouldn't have to rely upon any suppliers, especially foreign suppliers. On May 31st, 1929, Ford signed a 9-year technical assistance agreement with the Soviet government. Ford would help the Soviets set up an automobile plant, and the Soviets would purchase $30 million worth of knocked-down Ford trucks and cars. Ford sent his best servicemen to the Soviet factory to train the Russians. By the mid-1920s, the Model T sales, they were dwindling. Competitors were producing competing models, some of them with more powerful motors and better features. It was time for a new model to roll off the production lines. The Model A Ford was released in 1927. The car was available in a range of styles, including sports coupe, truck, and commercial. Unlike the Model T, it was available in 4 colors. The Model A was another hit for Ford, with sales to 1931 topping 4 million. By 1931, a third of all automobiles throughout the world were made by the Ford Motor Company. In the late 1920s, Ford began building airplanes. The most popular was the Ford 4AT Trimotor, commonly known as the Tin Goose. Ford, for this, was honored by the Smithsonian Institution for changing aviation history. Henry Ford hated labor unions. He was of the opinion that they served only the self-interest of labor bosses who were detrimental to workers. He felt that he was perfectly able to look after the interests of his works and saw no need for unions on his sites. In order to scare off union activity, Ford employed former Navy boxer Harry Bennett to head his service department. Bennett was not averse to using violence to squash union activity. On one occasion, he had men beat up United Auto Workers representatives as the police simply looked on. This incident, which became known as the Battle of the Overpass, was widely reported. It hurt Ford's reputation and it increased support for the union. Edsel Ford recognized that there was a need for a collective bargaining agreement with the unions. However, his father vetoed the idea of him even talking to the unions. In April 1941, there was a sit-down strike which closed down the River Rouge plant. Ford prepared to shut down his entire business rather than deal with the union. It was only the intervention of his long-suffering wife, Clara, that brought him to his senses. With the recalcitrance of the old man out of the way, Edsel managed to sign an agreement with the United Auto Workers Union in June of 1941. Ford's obsession with blaming the Jews for the world's ills intensified over the years. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, published 91 consecutive articles deriding Jews. Jewish leaders responded by calling for boycotts of Ford's cars. In 1927, he was sued for libel. The case was settled out of court. Shortly thereafter, Ford agreed to shut down production of his newspaper. In the early 1920s, Ford had been given a copy of a book called The Protocol of the Elders of Zion, which had been produced by the Russian Tsar's Secret Service in the early 1900s. It painted a damning picture of the supposed worldwide Jewish conspiracy. Ford, he believed every word of it. However, within a few years, it was exposed as a fake. When Ford learned of this, he was horrified and he offered an apology to the Jewish community, assuring them of his future friendship and goodwill. Despite these words, Ford continued to denounce Jews throughout the 1930s. He did business with Nazi Germany up to and including the war years. At the same time, he produced B-24 bombers for the US military. Ford is the only American mentioned favorably in Mein Kampf. Speaking in 1931 to a Detroit news reporter, Hitler said that he regarded Ford as his inspiration. This explained his reason for keeping Ford's life-size portrait next to his desk. Hitler revered Ford, stating that, "I shall do my best to put his theories into practice in Germany," and modeling the Volkswagen on the Model T. In May 1943, 49-year-old Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer. Henry, now aged 80, was forced to run the company once more. Yet, he was not a well man, having already suffered from a series of strokes and heart attacks. He was at the helm for 2 years, at which point he handed the reins over to his grandson, Henry Ford II. Henry Ford's retirement was short-lived. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 7, 1947, at his Dearborn estate. 100,000 people showed up at his funeral to honor the man who brought private transportation to the masses. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. As always, do give us a thumbs up, subscribe if you liked it, hit the notification bell so you'll find out when we put out a new video, and also do check out today's sponsor, that's Blinkist. You'll find a link to them below. It's really great stuff. Just go check it out now before you watch something else. Why not? And as always, thank you for watching.